should tell you this now, before you decide whether to keep listening. What I'm about to say cost someone their life. It cost me more than that. And if you think this is going to be another campfire story about shadows in the woods, you should probably stop here. Because dogmen rarely show themselves, and that's exactly why they're so dangerous. The one I'm going to tell you about didn't roar. It didn't chase. It didn't leave claw marks on trees or footprints in the mud. It waited. And I didn't understand what that meant until it was too late. I've spent the last 3 years replaying the first moment I sensed it. Not saw it, not heard it, sensed it. That's important. I was 39 at the time, a wildlife behavior consultant with a modest reputation and a bad habit of thinking I understood predators. I'd studied wolves in Alberta, black bears in Montana, even feral dog packs in the outskirts of Bucharest during a brief European research stint. I believed in patterns, instinct, territory. Every predator follows rules. That was my comfort. That was my mistake. The first time something felt wrong was late October, the air dry and metallic, the leaves rotting sweet beneath my boots. I remember the smell more than anything. Wet bark, cold soil, a faint copper note that didn't belong. It was just before dusk, when the forest turns flat and depth becomes unreliable. I was alone, which in hindsight feels like a confession. I'd chosen isolation because I trusted my training more than I trusted people. There's a difference between solitude and arrogance. I crossed it without noticing. You need to understand something before we go further. Dogmen rarely show themselves. That isn't superstition, it's strategy. Predators that want to survive do not advertise their presence. They don't posture unless they have to. And this one didn't have to. Not yet. I didn't see it that first evening. What I felt was absence. No bird calls, no wind through upper branches. Even the distant creek sounded muffled, as if the forest had swallowed its own voice. I stopped walking because the silence pressed against my ears hard enough to hurt. I remember laughing softly, a dry, stupid sound. "Relax, Alan," I muttered to myself. That was the only humor I allowed myself. A man alone in the woods, trying to outthink the dark. The temperature dropped fast. Cold slid through the seams of my jacket and settled against my ribs. I scanned the tree line. Nothing. No movement. No reflective eye shine. And yet my body reacted before my mind did. My shoulders tightened. My breathing shortened. Prey reactions. That bothered me more than the silence. I was not prey. I'd spent 2 decades studying animals that hunted. I knew their rhythms, their limits, their tells. This felt different. It felt patient. That word didn't occur to me until much later. At the time, I wrote it off as environmental pressure, barometric shift, encroaching storm. I packed up earlier than planned. Even that felt like overreaction. But as I hiked back toward the access road, I felt watched in a way that bypassed logic. Not curiosity, not territorial warning, assessment, as if something was measuring me. We like to imagine monsters as impulsive, violent, driven by hunger. That's easier to accept. What's harder is the idea of something studying you quietly, without malice, without haste. I reached my truck just as the last light drained from the sky. The forest exhaled behind me. Sound returned in fragments. A distant owl, the soft crack of settling branches. I told myself it was over, that I'd imagined the rest. I drove home with the heater blasting against the cold that had settled inside my bones. I didn't know then that this was the first open loop, the first invitation, because something had already decided I was worth watching. And when a predator decides that, the ending is rarely negotiable. I should have left the area. I should have trusted the animal part of my brain, that recognized a larger presence. Instead, I returned the next weekend. That decision still wakes me at night. The second time, I brought recording equipment, audio traps, trail cameras. I told colleagues I was tracking anomalous wolf migration. A half-truth. I didn't mention the silence. I didn't mention the copper smell. I didn't mention the way my pulse had spiked without cause. There are moments when admitting fear makes it real. I wasn't ready for that. The forest greeted me differently. Not hostile, not welcoming, just aware. The air felt thicker, damp with impending frost. My boots sank deeper into leaf litter, releasing that same sweet rot. I placed the first camera facing a narrow animal trail. My hands trembled slightly. Cold, I told myself. Always a rational explanation. As I adjusted the angle, I noticed something strange. The trail itself was clean. Too clean. No recent hoof marks, no scat, no disturbed underbrush. It looked used but unused, preserved. That's when I felt it again, that absence, like stepping into a room where conversation stops mid-sentence. I stood very still. The forest was not silent this time. There were distant sounds, but none close. Nothing within a radius that should have been alive with small mammals. My skin prickled. I whispered into my recorder, documenting environmental irregularities. My voice sounded smaller than I expected. I set 2 more cameras before dusk. Each time, I felt the same pressure building behind my sternum, a warning without language. By the time I finished, twilight had begun its slow collapse into dark. And that's when I saw the first sign. Not a creature, not movement. A single print pressed into the soft earth beside my truck. It wasn't there before. I am certain of that. I have replayed the sequence 1,000 times. The ground had been undisturbed when I arrived. The print was elongated, digitigrade, 4 toes, claw impressions subtle but present. Larger than any wolf track I had documented. Larger than any known canine in the region. The spacing suggested upright stance. My mouth went dry. The copper scent was stronger now, metallic and faintly sweet. I crouched, fingers hovering inches above the indentation. It was fresh. The edges hadn't crumbled. Whatever made it was close, or had been seconds ago. I did not hear it approach. I did not hear it leave. That's what unsettled me most. A predator of that size should displace air, snap twigs, disturb something, but there had been nothing. I felt the weight of being observed settle fully onto my shoulders. Not aggression, not yet. Recognition, as if it wanted me to know. A small payoff, you could say. Evidence, confirmation that my instincts weren't malfunctioning. But it raised a larger question I wasn't ready to answer. If it could approach silently once, how many times had it done so before I noticed? I stood slowly, scanning the tree line. The shadows were deeper now, pooling between trunks. I considered leaving immediately. Sensible choice. Logical. Instead, I took photographs, measurements. I documented like the scientist I was trained to be. Denial often disguises itself as professionalism. As I straightened, a branch cracked somewhere behind me. Close. Too close. I spun, heart slamming against my ribs. Nothing. Only layered darkness. I waited. 10 seconds. 20. The forest held its breath. And then, from somewhere to my left, came a low exhale. Not a growl, not a snarl. An exhale. Controlled. Deliberate. The sound of something choosing not to act. My knees weakened. I forced myself not to run. Running triggers pursuit. That's biology. Instead, I backed toward the driver's door, every step measured. The exhale did not repeat, but the feeling intensified, studied. weighed. The handle felt ice cold under my palm. I slid inside and locked the door faster than I'd like to admit. The interior smelled of vinyl and stale coffee. Human. Familiar. Safe, I told myself. But as I started the engine, headlights cutting through the trees, I caught something in the beam. Two eyes. Forward-facing, reflective, higher than a deer. Too steady for a bear. They did not blink. They did not retreat. They watched. And in that stillness, I understood something that still chills me now. It wasn't afraid of me. It wasn't curious. It was deciding. And that was the moment I should have left for good. Instead, I drove home with those eyes burned into my memory, unaware that by acknowledging it, by measuring it, by daring to return, I just made myself part of its pattern. I didn't tell anyone about the eyes. That's the part I'm most ashamed of. I told myself I needed more data before sounding irrational. I told myself professionals don't chase folklore. But that's not the truth. The truth is that if I said it out loud, it would solidify. It would stop being an anomaly and start being a threat. And I wasn't ready to accept that something had begun circling my life. I spent the next week reviewing the trail camera footage. I expected nothing. Maybe a distorted shadow, maybe a bear at an odd angle. Instead, the first two cameras captured nothing unusual. Deer at 2:13 a.m., a raccoon near dawn, wind-triggered blanks. The third camera, the one closest to where I'd found the print, recorded something else. At 3:47 a.m., the frame shifted slightly. Not enough to indicate impact, just a subtle adjustment, as if nudged with careful precision. Then a shape entered the far edge of the frame. It stayed at the periphery, always at the limit of infrared clarity. Tall, lean. The gait was wrong for a quadruped and wrong for a man. It moved upright for 3 steps, then lowered slightly, not fully dropping to all fours, but adjusting, like someone conserving energy. I replayed it until the pixels blurred. There was no clear face, no definitive outline, just suggestion. And that's the genius of it. Suggestion leaves room for doubt. Doubt keeps you stationary. I enhanced contrast, slowed the frames. At one point, the figure seemed to tilt its head toward the camera, toward me. I paused the image and felt that same tightening in my chest. It wasn't random movement. It was awareness of the device, awareness of me. The timestamp indicated it remained in frame for 11 seconds. 11 seconds of stillness. Then it stepped backward and vanished into the dark without disturbing a single branch. I checked the audio recorder next. Static, wind, my own voice narrating environmental conditions earlier that day. Then, at 3:46 a.m., 1 minute before the visual anomaly, there was a sound. A low, rhythmic pulse. Not mechanical, not wind. It was breath. Slow, controlled. Too close to the microphone to be ambient. I leaned back in my chair and removed my headphones. My office felt smaller, the walls closer. The hum of my refrigerator from the adjacent kitchen sounded intrusive. That was the first time I considered that it might not be confined to the forest. The thought came and went quickly, but it left residue. I returned to the site the following weekend. That decision marks the escalation. I convinced myself I needed clearer footage, better angles. I told myself science demands replication. But beneath that was something else. A pull, an attachment I didn't want to examine. Predators fascinate us. We want to understand what could kill us. We want proximity without consequence. That's the lie. The forest felt different again, colder. The sky a flat gray sheet, threatening snow. I noticed small details immediately. A broken sapling near the original camera location. Not snapped violently. Bent and twisted, Fibers spiraled as if gripped and turned. The print from the previous week was gone, washed by rain. In its place were impressions too shallow to measure, teasing evidence. I set up 2 additional cameras higher in the trees, angled downward. If it favored the periphery, I would force it into the center. That was the mindset. Force it, as if I had leverage. While securing the second elevated unit, I felt it again. Not just watched. Surrounded. The silence didn't fall completely this time. Instead, sound distorted. Bird calls cut short mid-note. A distant coyote yipped once, and then stopped abruptly. I climbed down slowly, boots slipping slightly against damp bark. When my feet hit the ground, I smelled it again. Stronger. Copper and something musky beneath it. My pulse accelerated despite conscious attempts to regulate it. I spoke aloud without meaning to. I know you're there. The words hung in the air, fragile and foolish. For a moment, nothing happened. Then from deeper within the trees came a soft footfall, measured, heavy but controlled. I turned toward the sound and caught movement between trunks. Not a full body. A shoulder, perhaps, gray fur catching weak light. Gone before I could confirm it. My breath fogged in front of me. I realized my hands were empty. No weapon, not even bear spray. I had come armed with cameras and arrogance. I began backing toward my truck again, refusing to pivot fully. Showing your back is an invitation. Halfway there, I heard it clearly for the first time. A low vocalization. Not quite a growl, more like a hum, resonating through a large chest cavity. It vibrated in the air, subtle but unmistakable. Not a warning, not territorial aggression. Communication. I froze. The hum stopped. My heart pounded loud enough to mask smaller sounds. I strained to hear breathing, movement, anything. Instead, there was a new sensation. Pressure. Not on my ears this time, but on my thoughts. A heaviness, as if something was aligning itself with my awareness. I know how that sounds. I do. I've spent my career dismissing anthropomorphic projections, but in that moment, I felt studied, not just physically, but mentally. As if it were mapping my reactions, testing boundaries. I reached the truck without incident and drove home slower than usual, scanning the rearview mirror more than the road. That night, I dreamed of standing in the forest while something circled just beyond sight. I woke to the smell of copper in my bedroom, faint but present. I checked every window, every vent. Nothing. The next morning I found something on my porch. Mud. A single elongated smear across the wooden plank near the door. Too deliberate to be random. Too high off the ground to be tracked by a domestic dog. I crouched and touched it. Still damp. My hands shook as I stood. That was the shift from curiosity to intrusion. It had followed. Or it had already known. I wanted to call someone. Law enforcement would laugh. Colleagues would recommend rest. Instead, I reviewed the new footage. The elevated cameras captured a clearer silhouette this time. Tall, shoulders broad but not bulky. Arms longer than proportionate to a human frame. At one point, it stepped directly beneath the camera and looked up. The infrared caught the eyes in full clarity. Yellow-green reflection. Forward-facing. Intelligent. The muzzle was visible for less than a second. Elongated but controlled, lips tight, no bared teeth. It wasn't displaying. It was presenting. I paused the frame and felt something unexpected. Not just fear. Recognition. A terrible understanding that it had allowed this image. That it knew exactly where the lens was. That it wanted me to see enough. That's when the stakes shifted again. This was no longer an animal behaving within predictable ecological parameters. This was interaction. An interaction implies intention. I should have ended it there, destroyed the footage, walked away. Instead, I leaned closer to the screen, studying the still frame of those eyes, and whispered a question I never should have asked. Why me? The video crackled slightly in response, a distortion across the image, as if interference had brushed the signal. The figure tilted its head a fraction in the frozen frame, and in that silent, pixelated gesture, I felt the first thread tighten between us. The first time I understood that this wasn't about territory was the night it stopped hiding at the edge of the frame. Up until then, it had stayed just far enough away to preserve doubt. A shoulder in shadow, a partial silhouette, an eye caught in infrared. It allowed ambiguity to protect my denial. But 3 weeks after the porch incident, it changed tactics. That's when the attachment began to feel mutual. I returned to the forest under the pretense of dismantling my equipment. That's what I told myself. Close the loop. End the experiment. I rehearsed the decision like a confession on the drive out, promising I was done. But even as I said it, I knew I was lying. There's a difference between fear and fascination, and by then they were braided together so tightly I couldn't separate them. The air that afternoon was unnaturally warm for November, the kind of heat that doesn't belong to the season. The forest floor steamed faintly under filtered light. It smelled richer now, decay deepened by thaw. And beneath it all was that metallic note, faint but persistent, like a memory you can't quite place. I retrieved the first camera without incident, the second too. No disturbances, no obvious signs of interference. The third unit, the elevated one that had captured the clearest silhouette, was still fixed to the tree. But the bark around it had been scored, not clawed wildly, not shredded, scored in parallel lines, shallow and deliberate, as if marked with a tool. 4 lines, evenly spaced. I ran my fingers across them and felt how precise they were. Not territorial marking, not sharpening, a message. My pulse thudded in my throat. I lowered the camera and checked the timestamp. It had recorded something at 2:12 a.m. 2 nights prior. I didn't watch it there. I don't know why. Some instinct told me not to view it in the forest. Instead, I packed the last of the equipment and started back toward the truck. That's when I felt the shift. The silence didn't descend this time. Instead, sound receded outward, as if pulled away from me in widening circles. The leaves at my feet seemed too loud, my breathing too sharp. I stopped walking. There's a moment before prey bolts when it calculates distance. I've seen it in deer, in elk. That flicker of math behind the eyes. I felt that flicker inside myself. I didn't run. I turned slowly. It stood between 2 trees, roughly 30 yards back, upright, fully visible for the first time. Taller than any man I've met, but not exaggerated, not monstrous in the theatrical sense. Its proportions were wrong in subtle ways. The arms hung longer than they should. The shoulders were narrow but powerful, the chest deep, fur mottled gray with darker striping along the flanks. The head, God, the head, canine in structure, but held with human stillness. Forward-facing eyes locked on mine. No bared teeth, no overt aggression, just presence. It didn't step forward. It didn't need to. The distance felt intentional, close enough to confirm, far enough to maintain advantage. The copper scent intensified instantly. My stomach tightened. I forced myself to remain upright, to keep my movements slow. Every instinct screamed to break eye contact, but I couldn't. There was intelligence there, not animal cunning alone. Calculation, recognition. It tilted its head slightly, the same angle from the footage. A mirrored gesture. My throat felt dry, but I spoke anyway. "What do you want?" The words sounded absurd the moment they left my mouth. It didn't respond verbally. Instead, it inhaled deeply, chest expanding, nostrils flaring, testing the air, testing me. Then it took one step sideways, maintaining the same distance, not retreating, repositioning, herding. I felt it then, the boundaries of the clearing, the subtle narrowing of my exit routes. It wasn't attacking, it was shaping. I shifted my weight toward the direction of my truck, slow and deliberate. It adjusted again, a mirrored step, not closing the gap, maintaining the line. The message was clear in a way that bypassed language. You move when I allow it. A cold realization settled over me. All the previous encounters had not been reconnaissance for an ambush. They had been conditioning, acclimation, teaching me to tolerate its presence without immediate panic. Desensitization, the kind you use in controlled behavioral experiments. Only I was the subject. I took another step backward. It stopped moving. Its eyes did not blink. Seconds stretched painfully long. I could hear my heartbeat in my ears. Finally, after what felt like a full minute of stasis, it shifted its gaze slightly to my left. Just a fraction. I followed the glance instinctively, and that was my mistake. The moment my eyes left it, it vanished. Not in a blur, not in a leap. It simply wasn't there anymore. No footfalls, no crashing brush. Just absence. The space between the trees empty. I spun, scanning every angle. Nothing. The forest sounds trickled back in cautiously. A distant woodpecker resumed tapping. Wind brushed higher branches. My knees weakened, but I forced myself to move, to close the remaining distance to the truck without looking back. I didn't run until I reached the road. That night, I watched the 2:12 a.m. footage. It showed the clearing empty for several minutes. Then, from behind the camera, it stepped into frame, meaning it had approached from the blind side, from the direction I would have been standing during setup. It walked to the center of the clearing and stood facing the lens. Not pacing, not sniffing, just standing. After 8 seconds, it raised one arm slowly and extended a single claw toward the camera, stopping inches from it. Not striking, hovering. Then it lowered the arm and stepped back into darkness. No sound, no distortion, just controlled display. That was the first warning I fully understood. It could have destroyed the equipment. It chose not to. It wanted continuity, ongoing interaction. The stakes escalated from observation to relationship in that moment. And relationships, even predatory ones, require proximity. I slept poorly that night. Around 3 a.m., I woke abruptly, certain I had heard something in my hallway. Not a crash, not a footstep, a shift in air pressure. I lay still, listening. My house felt wrong, too quiet. Then faintly I heard it, a low exhale from somewhere beyond my bedroom door. Controlled, deliberate. The same sound from the forest. I sat up slowly, heart hammering. The copper scent was unmistakable now. Strong, present. My hand hovered over the bedside lamp, but didn't turn it on. Light reveals you as much as it reveals the room. I swung my legs over the side of the bed and stood, moving toward the door one measured step at a time. The floorboards were cool under my feet. I opened the door an inch. Darkness pooled in the hallway. Empty. I flicked the light switch. Nothing stood there. No silhouette, no movement. But at the far end of the hall, near the back door, I saw 4 shallow parallel gouges carved into the wood frame. Evenly spaced, precise, the same as the tree bark. My breath caught painfully in my throat. It had crossed the boundary, and in doing so, it had closed another illusion I'd been clinging to. This wasn't confined to a location. It wasn't protecting territory. It was maintaining contact with me. I touched the gouges lightly. The edges were fresh, splintered inward, made from outside. The door itself remained locked. No broken glass, no forced entry. It hadn't needed to come inside to make its point. It only needed me to know it could reach the threshold. I stood there for a long time, hand resting against the damaged wood, feeling the weight of what I had invited into my life. Because that's what this was becoming. Not a chance encounter, not a random anomaly, a pattern, a progression. And patterns, once established, tend to complete themselves. I didn't call the police. I didn't tell a colleague. I did something far worse. I whispered into the empty hallway, "I'm still here." And somewhere beyond the walls, in the dark that felt closer than it should have, something shifted in response. I don't know why I said that. I've replayed the moment over and over, searching for logic, for some rational thread I can hold on to. But the truth is simpler and uglier. I didn't want it to leave. That's the part that's hardest to admit. Fear had already fused with fascination, and beneath both of them was something else. Recognition. I had spent my life studying predators from a safe academic distance, observing, interpreting, categorizing. And now something was observing me back with equal patience. It felt like a terrible symmetry. The days after the hallway gouges blurred into a strained imitation of normalcy. I went to work. I answered emails. I participated in a conference call about coyote behavioral drift near suburban zones. I even made a dry joke about how urban encroachment was turning predators into better strategists than us. No one laughed. I heard the hollowness in my own voice. Every evening, I returned home with a tightening in my chest. The copper scent lingered faintly in the entryway. Sometimes it was stronger near the back door, sometimes absent entirely, which was worse. Presence you can confront. Absence leaves you guessing. I installed motion lights around the perimeter of the house, cameras too. It felt performative, like locking a screen door against a storm. The first night they were active, nothing triggered. The second night, at 2:47 a.m., the backyard light flicked on. I woke before the notification tone sounded, as if something had brushed my awareness directly. I sat upright in bed and waited. The light clicked off after 30 seconds. I checked the footage from my phone. Static image of the yard. Fence intact. Trees swaying lightly. No visible figure. But at the very edge of the frame, where the infrared bled into shadow, I noticed distortion. Not movement. Warping. As if the air itself bent subtly for 2 frames before stabilizing. I zoomed in. Pixels broke apart under magnification. Nothing conclusive. Suggestion again. Enough to keep doubt alive. The next morning, I found something pressed into the soil near the fence line. Not a full print. A partial indentation. As if weight had been applied carefully, then lifted. The grass around it was flattened in a circular pattern, like something had crouched. Watching the back door. Watching the house. Watching me. I began sleeping with the lights on. That's when the dreams intensified. Not nightmares exactly. Not chaotic. Structured. In the dreams, I stood in the same forest clearing, but the trees were arranged in concentric circles, and it moved between them silently, always just beyond the next ring. I could hear its breathing. Slow, even, patient. When I woke, the smell was always there. Strongest at dawn. The third week after the first full sighting, it escalated again. I was in my living room, reviewing footage from the backyard camera for the 5th time that day. The house felt heavy, the air thick as if before a thunderstorm. Outside, the sky was overcast, light diffused and flat. Around 4:15 p.m., while it was still daylight, I heard a sound against the side of the house. Not a knock, not a scrape, a soft, deliberate drag. I froze. The sound continued for several feet along the exterior wall, then stopped directly beneath the living room window. My pulse spiked so violently it made my vision blur. I did not approach the glass. Instead, I stepped backward slowly, keeping my gaze fixed on the curtains. The copper scent seeped through the room gradually, unmistakable. It was close, closer than ever. The drag sound resumed, lighter this time, tracing the frame of the window itself. 4 distinct pauses, parallel contact points. My throat tightened. It wasn't trying to break in, it was marking, reinforcing the pattern. You are within reach. I forced myself to speak, though my voice trembled. You don't belong here. Silence answered, but not empty silence, charged silence. After a long minute, I heard a single footstep on the porch. Heavy, controlled. Then nothing. I waited 5 full minutes before daring to look. When I finally pulled the curtain aside an inch, the yard appeared undisturbed. No broken boards, no shattered glass. Just the faintest smear on the window, barely visible unless the light hit it at an angle. 4 streaks, evenly spaced. I stepped outside eventually, legs unsteady, scanning every tree line, every shadow. The air felt warmer than it should have, dense. And then I noticed the door, the back door I'd inspected obsessively for days. The wood around the handle bore new impressions, not gouges this time. Indentations shaped like fingertips, elongated and too narrow to be human, as if it had tested the latch, not forcing, feeling, mapping resistance. That was the first moment I truly considered leaving my house entirely. Not just the forest, not just the town, but something held me in place. Pride, maybe, or the sick need to see the progression through to its conclusion. I told myself relocation would solve nothing. If it had found me once, it could find me again. The following night, it made the decision for me. At 3:03 a.m., every exterior light activated simultaneously. I bolted upright, heart hammering. The phone notification chimed in my hand before I realized I was holding it. Live feed, backyard camera, front porch camera, side yard, all triggered at once. I opened the front porch view first. The lens showed the empty steps for 2 seconds. Then, from the left side of the frame, it stepped into full view. Upright, close enough that the fur texture was visible, even through infrared. The shoulders rose and fell with slow breaths. The eyes reflected green-yellow directly into the camera. It stood there, centered, not moving. The proximity stole the air from my lungs. It was taller than my door frame. I switched to the backyard feed. Empty. Side yard. Empty. Back to the porch. Still there. It leaned slightly forward, bringing its face closer to the lens. The muzzle elongated but controlled. Lips sealed. No teeth. Just observation. My pulse thundered in my ears. I whispered, "Why?" though it couldn't hear me through the glass. Or maybe it could. It raised one arm slowly and placed its clawed hand against the door. Not striking. Resting. Testing the barrier. The wood creaked softly under pressure. I realized then that every previous encounter had been calibration. Distance, sound, scent, boundaries. This was the next phase. Physical contact with the threshold. It lowered its hand after several seconds and tilted its head again. That mirrored gesture, that recognition. And then, without haste, it stepped backward off the porch and out of frame. I didn't breathe until the lights clicked off one by one. I stayed awake until sunrise, staring at the frozen last frame on my phone. In daylight, I opened the door cautiously. The porch boards bore deep impressions where its weight had settled. The wood near the handle was splintered inward slightly. It had pressed hard enough to test structural limits, hard enough to know how much force would be required. That was the escalation from message to rehearsal. I stood there in the cold morning air and understood something with awful clarity. It wasn't hunting me in the traditional sense. It was studying thresholds, physical ones, psychological ones, waiting for the moment I would open the door myself. And the most terrifying realization of all was this. Part of me was beginning to consider doing exactly that. The idea didn't arrive all at once. It crept in quietly, the way it did. Open the door, just once. End the uncertainty. End the slow erosion. That was the lie I told myself. Closure, scientific confrontation. But beneath it was something raw and indefensible. I wanted to see if it would still choose patience when there was no barrier between us. I began tracking its visits like appointments. 2:12 a.m., 3:03 a.m., 2:47 a.m. There was no fixed pattern, but there was rhythm. Never consecutive nights, never predictable intervals. It allowed enough silence for doubt to regenerate before returning to reset the tension. Conditioning. Again and again, I recognized the technique while remaining inside it. Sleep deprivation settled in like a fog. I started leaving the porch light off intentionally. That detail matters. It removed one layer of separation. If it came, I wanted to see it clearly, not through glare. I stopped telling myself I was defending my home. I was participating. The fourth week after the first full sighting, it escalated beyond rehearsal. It was just past midnight when I felt that internal pressure shift. No external trigger, no light activation, just the sensation of proximity pressing against my thoughts. I was seated in the living room, every lamp on, television muted. The copper scent slid under the doorframe gradually, undeniable. My hands were steady in a way that frightened me, anticipatory calm. Then came the sound. Not on the porch, not at the window, directly at the front door. A single firm knock. Not claws dragging, not testing. Knuckles. 3 measured strikes spaced evenly apart. The sound was deep and resonant, vibrating through the wood. My breath caught halfway in. It knew the gesture. It understood the symbolism. I stood slowly. Each step toward the door felt deliberate, chosen. There was a moment before irreversible action, when the world narrows to a thin line. I felt that narrowing. I stopped inches from the door, my hand hovering near the handle. The copper scent was overwhelming now, metallic and warm. Through the wood, I could hear breathing, slow, controlled. The same rhythm from the forest, not agitated, not hungry, waiting. My heart pounded so loudly, I wondered if it could hear it. A second knock came, softer this time, almost patient. I whispered, "This isn't how it works." My voice sounded fragile. The breathing continued. Then something unexpected happened. It spoke. Not words, not language. A low, layered vocalization that vibrated through the door and into my chest. It wasn't a growl. It carried tone, intonation, a cadence disturbingly close to mimicry, as if it had listened to human speech long enough to approximate the structure without forming syllables. My knees weakened. The boundary between species felt thinner than it should have. I realized then that it wasn't waiting for permission in the conventional sense. It was measuring my willingness. I don't know how long we stood like that, separated by less than 2 inches of wood. Eventually, the breathing stopped. Silence returned abruptly. I remained frozen, hands still hovering. Minutes passed. I didn't open it. Not that night. At 6:10 a.m., when pale light filtered through the curtains, I finally unlocked the deadbolt and pulled the door open. The porch was empty, but the door itself bore new markings. Not gouges, not indentations. A pattern traced lightly into the wood with the tip of a claw. A circle, imperfect but deliberate, roughly chest height. I stared at it for a long time. A boundary symbol, or a claim. I don't know which interpretation frightens me more. That day, I made the worst decision of my life. I removed the cameras, all of them, exterior and interior. I told myself it was reclaiming privacy, reasserting control. But the truth was uglier. I didn't want documentation anymore. I wanted direct experience. No filters, no replay. That night, I left the porch light off again. I left the living room dark. I sat in the armchair facing the door and waited. Midnight passed. 1 a.m., 2 a.m. The house creaked softly as temperatures dropped. Doubt began to creep back in. Maybe I had imagined escalation. Maybe the knock had been structural contraction. Maybe the circle was coincidence. That's how it works. It allows doubt to soften you right before the next step. At 2:23 a.m., the handle moved. Slowly, not rattled violently. Turned. The latch clicked softly against resistance. It had learned the mechanism. I stood. My legs felt distant, like they belonged to someone else. The handle rotated again, testing, then stopped. A pause. The breathing resumed on the other side, closer than ever. And then, in a gesture so subtle it took me seconds to comprehend, the door pushed inward slightly. Not forced, nudged. The wood bowed under steady pressure. The deadbolt held, but barely. My mind fractured into competing impulses. Run, hide, call someone, open it. The last impulse pulsed strongest. End the rehearsal, end the study, end the waiting. I stepped forward until my face was inches from the door. "If you come in," I whispered, "it changes." The breathing paused. Complete stillness followed. For a fraction of a second, I thought it had retreated. Then the pressure increased abruptly. The doorframe splintered with a sharp crack. The deadbolt tore free from the wood, screws ripping out in one violent motion. The door flew inward, slamming against the wall. Cold night air flooded the room, carrying the copper scent in a suffocating wave. It stood in the doorway, filling it completely. Upright, massive, eyes locked on mine. There was no roar, no dramatic lunge, just entry. Slow, deliberate, one step across the threshold. The house seemed to shrink around it. Its head tilted slightly again, studying my reaction. I did not run. I don't know why. Shock, perhaps, or the culmination of weeks of conditioning. It took another step forward, claws clicking softly against hard wood. The sound was intimate, domestic, wrong. My chest tightened painfully. I realized with absolute clarity that every previous boundary had been rehearsal for this moment, and I had just participated in the final invitation. It stopped 6 feet from me, close enough that I could see the texture of its fur, the subtle scar along its collarbone, the steady expansion of its rib cage. Its eyes were not wild. They were focused, present. It lowered its head slightly, bringing its face level with mine. The copper scent mixed with something warmer now, animal musk, heat radiating from its body. It raised one arm slowly. I saw the claws flex once, not in threat, in consideration, and then very gently it placed its hand against the center of my chest, directly over my heart. The pressure was firm, but not piercing. My pulse hammered beneath its palm. It inhaled deeply, as if feeling the rhythm through bone and muscle. The room seemed to hold its breath with it. In that contact, something shifted irreversibly. Not just fear, not just danger. Connection. And as its claws tightened fractionally against my shirt, just enough to break skin, I understood that the next escalation would not be about thresholds or doors. It would be about ownership. Its claws did not sink in deeply, not at first. They pressed just hard enough to pierce fabric, to let the smallest line of warmth slide down my sternum. I felt the sting a half-second after the pressure. My breath caught in a sharp, involuntary gasp. It did not react to the sound. It was focused entirely on the rhythm beneath its palm. My heartbeat, fast, irregular, human. It inhaled again, slow and measured, nostrils flaring inches from my face. I could see the faint tremor in its whiskers with each breath. The heat radiating from its body was intense, almost feverish. It smelled like iron and damp fur, and something older beneath that, something mineral and deep, like stone after rain. I whispered, "You don't have to do this." The sentence was absurd. I knew that even as I said it. It wasn't here out of confusion. It wasn't improvising. This had been built step by step, week by week. Conditioning, calibration. The claws tightened slightly. Not enough to tear, enough to anchor. My mind raced through possibilities. Fight, flight. Neither felt viable. I had allowed it inside. I had removed the cameras. I had stood at the door and spoken to it, as if it were something that could negotiate. That was the moral compromise, the irreversible one. It tilted its head again, studying my face. Its eyes were clearer up close than they had ever been on screen. Yellow-green, yes, but layered, reflective depth behind the glow. There was no frenzy there, no hunger-driven madness, just assessment. And something else, recognition, as if it had confirmed a hypothesis. Slowly it slid its claws upward along my chest, fabric tearing softly under the movement. The sensation was intimate in a way that made my stomach twist. Not violent, deliberate. Its hand came to rest against my collarbone, claws grazing skin lightly. The scar along its own collarbone caught my eye again. A pale line beneath gray fur. Old injury, healed. My brain seized on that detail irrationally. It could be hurt. It could bleed. That thought sparked something desperate inside me. I moved without fully deciding to. My right hand shot toward the fireplace poker leaning against the hearth behind me. The shift in my posture was enough. Its eyes sharpened instantly. The hand at my collarbone tightened, claws piercing deeper this time. Pain flared hot and immediate. I gasped again. It didn't retreat. It leaned closer. The low hum vibrated from its chest once more, louder now, resonating through my ribs. Warning. I froze mid-motion, fingers inches from the poker. The message was unmistakable. That line, too, had been measured. It withdrew its claws slightly, enough to reduce the bleeding but not the pressure. Then, with a slow deliberateness that still haunts me, it guided me backward one step. Not shoved, guided, steering. I stumbled slightly but didn't fall. It took a step forward to close the distance again. Herding. The clearing in the forest flashed through my mind. The mirrored movements. The shaping of space. My living room had become another clearing, another controlled environment. It maneuvered me until the back of my knees hit the armchair. I sat without meaning to. The movement felt less like surrender and more like gravity asserting itself. It remained standing, towering over me. The power imbalance was absolute, and yet it did not strike. It did not tear. It simply watched. My blood soaked slowly into my shirt, warm against cooling air. The copper scent thickened between us. It lowered itself then, not fully crouching, but bending at the knees enough that its eyes were level with mine again. The proximity made my skin crawl. I could see faint scars along its forearms, small, healed punctures, evidence of conflict somewhere, sometime. Not invincible, but practiced. It lifted its other hand slowly and placed it against my temple. The claws were cool this time, the touch almost gentle. My pulse thundered. For a split second, I considered that it might crush my skull, end it cleanly. Instead, it held my head steady and leaned forward until its forehead touched mine. The contact was electric. Not literal electricity, but a surge of something that felt like pressure behind my eyes. Images flickered, not visions, not hallucinations exactly, but impressions. Forest at night, elevated vantage points, my house from the tree line, me unloading equipment weeks ago, me standing at the door, observed, catalogued. The realization hit like a physical blow. It wasn't just studying my behavior in the moment. It had been mapping my patterns for longer than I knew. Days before the first print, weeks before the first camera. I made a sound then. Not a word, something between a sob and a laugh. "You chose me," I whispered. Its breathing deepened at that. Not confirmation, not denial, just intensified focus. The pressure at my temple increased slightly, enough to hurt. And then, without warning, it withdrew both hands at once. I sucked in air sharply, as if surfacing from underwater. It stood to full height again, towering. For one fragile second, I thought it might leave. That the entry had been symbolic, a completed stage. But escalation doesn't reverse. It turned its head toward the hallway leading to my bedroom. Just a slight shift, then back to me. The message was clear. Movement. I shook my head instinctively. No. The word came out small. It took one step toward the hallway, then paused, looking back at me. Waiting. That was the most terrifying part. It was giving me a choice within parameters it had already defined. Follow or resist. Compliance or consequence. The stakes had climbed from psychological intrusion to physical domination. The next tier was identity. Ownership. I stood slowly, chest burning where its claws had broken skin. I took one step toward the hallway. It mirrored me immediately, satisfaction, or something like it, flickering in its eyes. Another step. The house felt unreal, distorted by its presence. We moved together down the narrow corridor, predator and willing subject. At the bedroom door, it stopped and let me enter first. That detail matters. It did not push past me. It allowed me to cross the threshold ahead of it. I turned slowly once inside. What happens next? My voice cracked on the last word. It stepped into the room and closed the distance between us in 2 silent strides. The copper scent was suffocating now. It reached out once more, claws hovering inches from my chest wound. And then it pressed its palm flat over the bleeding fabric again, harder this time. My heart hammered violently beneath its grip. It leaned in close, muzzle near my ear, and released a low vibration that felt almost like a whisper without words. In that sound was something final, not hunger, not rage. Claim. And as the pressure increased until my vision began to blur at the edges, I understood that the escalation was no longer about entering my house, or testing my boundaries. It was about rewriting them entirely. It would be easier to tell you that I fought. That instinct returned in some cinematic rush, and I became what I'd always believed I was: rational, decisive, unwilling to yield. That isn't what happened. When its palm pressed harder against my chest and the vibration deepened in its throat, something inside me shifted in the opposite direction. Not collapse. Alignment. My heartbeat, frantic seconds earlier, began to slow under its grip. Not because I willed it to, because it matched the rhythm it was projecting. Slow, even, dominant. My body responded the way prey does when escape is impossible. It synchronized. That was the first loss. Not blood, not territory. Autonomy. It lowered its muzzle to the side of my neck and inhaled deeply, the heat of its breath seeping into my skin. I felt the shape of its claws through my shirt, the precise awareness of where my ribs ended and my throat began. It wasn't guessing. It knew. The low hum shifted again, rising slightly in pitch, layered and complex. I felt it behind my eyes, in my jaw, in the marrow of my bones. I've spent years since trying to describe that sensation without sounding unhinged. The closest I can come is this. It felt like being read. Every reflex, every fear, every private calculation laid bare. And then it did something I still struggled to explain. It withdrew its hand from my chest, and instead of striking, it stepped back. One full step. The pressure in the room lightened instantly. My lungs filled more easily. It studied me from that short distance, head tilted, eyes sharp but not wild. Waiting. The choice again. I could have run then. The hallway was clear. The front door hung broken but open. I could have bolted into the night and gambled on distance. Instead, I remained where I was. That was the second loss. It saw the decision settle in my posture, saw the absence of flight. Its shoulders relaxed fractionally. Not relief, confirmation. It stepped forward once more, slower now, and placed its clawed hand against the center of my chest, with less force than before. The contact was almost gentle. The message was unmistakable. You understand the pattern. I nodded before I realized I was doing it. That tiny movement felt heavier than any scream. It lowered its head until its forehead touched mine again, and the impressions returned. Forest edges, distant rooftops, the shape of my house from elevated ground. But this time there was something new, layered into the sequence. My silhouette at the door. My hand hovering over the handle, my voice whispering into the hallway, I'm still here. The implication hit me harder than the physical wound. It had not forced the progression alone. I had signaled readiness at every stage. Conditioning works both ways. It wasn't only shaping me. I had been shaping the encounter by refusing to break the loop. When it finally withdrew completely and stepped toward the bedroom window, I felt something twist inside my chest. Not relief, anticipation. It placed one claw lightly against the glass, leaving a faint curved line in the condensation, then looked back at me one last time. The head tilt again. A mirrored image burned into my mind. And then, with a fluid motion that made no sound at all, it moved through the window frame, as if the barrier meant nothing, vanishing into the dark beyond the yard. I stood there shaking long after it was gone. The house felt cavernous, smaller and larger at the same time. My chest throbbed where its claws had broken skin, but the bleeding had already slowed. The wound was shallow, measured. It hadn't come to kill me. That realization was more destabilizing than death would have been. It had come to establish something. A hierarchy, a pattern of access, and I had allowed the final boundary to fall without resistance. That was the climax. Not violence, not destruction. Consent within constraint. The next morning, neighbors commented casually about hearing nothing unusual. No broken glass, no disturbances. I repaired the doorframe myself, hands steady, movements mechanical. I did not reinstall the cameras. I did not file a report. I did not return to the forest. But the forest returned to me in subtler ways. The copper scent would appear in rooms with no open windows. The motion lights would flick on at irregular intervals, and then shut off before I reached the door. Once at dusk, I saw a tall silhouette at the edge of my yard, just beyond the tree line. It did not approach. It did not need to. The relationship had shifted. Physical intrusion was no longer required to reinforce the pattern. I began withdrawing from colleagues. Calls went unanswered. Research proposals stalled. I caught myself standing at the front door some nights, hand resting against the wood, remembering the weight of its palm over my heart. That is the part I am most ashamed of. Missing it. Not the danger, the clarity. In its presence, there had been no ambiguity about my place in the hierarchy of the natural world. No academic buffer, no illusion of control. Just position, defined and undeniable. Weeks turned into months. The visits became less frequent, but never fully ceased. Sometimes I would wake at 3 a.m. to the faintest vibration in the air, that layered hum too distant to localize. Sometimes I would find 4 shallow lines pressed into soil near the porch, fresh and deliberate. Never aggressive, never random. A reminder. The wound on my chest healed into a thin crescent scar directly over my sternum. On cold mornings it aches faintly, as if responding to changes in pressure. I've considered relocation more times than I can count. But deep down, I know geography isn't the anchor. Pattern is. And once you participate in a predator's pattern, distance becomes theoretical. I stopped asking, why me? The better question is, why not? I signaled curiosity. I demonstrated tolerance. I removed documentation. I opened the door. Dogmen rarely show themselves. That's not because they fear exposure. It's because visibility is a tool best used sparingly. The true danger isn't the silhouette in the forest or the figure on the porch. It's the gradual erosion of your boundaries until you mistake conditioning for connection. I tell you this now because I can feel the pattern tightening again. The intervals between reminders are shortening. Last night, at exactly 2:12 a.m., I heard 3 measured knocks at the repaired front door. I did not move toward it. Not this time. I remained in my chair, hands gripping the armrests until my knuckles ached. The knocks did not repeat, but the copper scent drifted through the hallway moments later, subtle and patient. I know what it's waiting for. Not entry, not violence. Invitation. And the most dangerous part of all is that somewhere beneath the fear, beneath the shame, and the understanding of what it cost me, there is still a fragment of me that wants to stand up, walk to that door, and whisper through the wood, I'm still here. You'd think this is where I would tell you I found religion, or therapy, or a firearm big enough to restore the illusion of control. That would make the story cleaner. It would make me easier to forgive. That isn't what happened. What happened was slower, quieter. The pattern didn't end after the knocks resumed. It refined itself. The intervals tightened exactly as I feared. 3 nights apart, then 2, then consecutive evenings where the copper scent would appear without sound, without lights flickering, without any visible trace. Presence without performance. It no longer needed spectacle. It had already established access. I stopped sleeping in my bedroom. The window it had used felt compromised, even after I replaced the glass and reinforced the frame. I moved a chair into the living room and began keeping vigil again, though I told myself it was to resist this time, to break the loop. The first night I committed to not responding. The knock came at 2:12 a.m. precisely. 3 measured strikes. I didn't move. My heart raced, but I forced my hands to remain still. The copper scent seeped in beneath the door, like a slow tide. The breathing followed, faint, controlled, unmistakable. I stared straight ahead, refusing to look at the handle. The deadbolt held. The door did not bow. After several long minutes, the breathing faded. Silence returned. I thought I had succeeded. I thought refusal was enough. That assumption lasted exactly 24 hours. The following evening, there was no knock, no scent, no vibration, just absence. The kind that presses harder than presence ever did. I found myself pacing near the door, listening for something that didn't come. That was the moment I understood the final escalation. It had inverted the dynamic. By withholding contact, it created the same anticipatory tension it had once imposed through intrusion. Conditioning complete. I was waiting for it. That realization hollowed me out. I forced myself to leave the house the next morning, drove without direction, parked near the edge of the forest but did not enter. I stayed in the truck for nearly an hour, watching the tree line. It felt closer than I remembered. Or maybe I was simply more aware of the vantage points now. Elevated ground, overlapping sight lines, places something tall could stand and observe without being seen. The wind shifted once, and faintly, so faintly I questioned my sanity, I caught the copper scent through the cracked window. Not strong, just enough. I started the engine and left immediately. That night, I dismantled what remained of the interior repairs. I removed the extra deadbolt, unscrewed the reinforcement plate. I told myself I was eliminating the symbol of fear. But if I'm honest, it was something else. Barriers had become performative. The real boundary had been crossed weeks ago when I chose not to run. Around 3 a.m., I felt the pressure shift again. No knock this time, no sound at all. Just that internal awareness tightening like a wire. I walked to the front door before I consciously decided to. My hand rested against the wood where its palm had pressed weeks earlier. The scar on my chest throbbed in dull rhythm. "I'm not opening it," I said quietly. The statement felt thin. Behind the door, I heard the faintest exhale. Not loud, not threatening. A reminder. My pulse quickened despite my resolve. Minutes passed. The air thickened with metallic warmth. And then, slowly, the handle turned. I hadn't locked it. The latch clicked free with a soft mechanical sound that felt louder than the earlier splintering ever had. The door eased inward a few inches on its own weight. Cold air slipped across my face. I did not step back. I did not step forward. It stood just beyond the threshold, partially obscured by darkness. Not fully entering, not fully hidden. The same measured stillness. It didn't need to force entry anymore. The choice was structural now, not mechanical. I swallowed hard. "If I let you in again," I whispered, "there's no pretending after that." The head tilted slightly, a mirrored gesture I knew too well. The copper scent intensified. It took one step forward, bringing its face into the faint spill of streetlight from the road. The eyes reflected back at me, steady, unblinking, aware. There was no rage there, no hunger, just inevitability. I realized then that this wasn't about ownership in the way I first understood it. It wasn't claiming my house or my body. It was claiming space inside my decision-making, inside my identity. The erosion had worked. because it never relied on force alone. It relied on my participation. I stepped aside. Just a fraction. Enough. It entered without touching me this time. No claws. No pressing palm against my heart. It walked past me into the living room and stood in the center of the space, as if reacquainting itself with a familiar environment. I closed the door quietly behind it. That sound, the soft click of wood meeting frame, felt heavier than the splintering weeks earlier. It turned to face me. The room felt smaller, the air denser. It approached slowly and stopped an arm's length away. The hum returned, softer than before, almost content. I felt no surge of panic now, just a heavy, regretful clarity. "This is the last time," I said, though I wasn't sure whether I was promising or pleading. It raised one clawed hand and hovered it over the scar on my chest without touching. Close enough that I felt the residual warmth. Then it lowered its hand and, for the first time since this began, it did something different. It stepped backward, one slow step, then another, maintaining eye contact. It reached the door and paused, the head tilt again. A final mirrored question. I didn't move. I didn't speak. After several long seconds, it opened the door itself and stepped out into the night. The door closed behind it gently. No splintering, no pressure, just quiet departure. I stood there for a long time, waiting for the scent to fade, waiting for the vibration to return. It didn't. Days have passed now. No knocks, no prints in the soil, no motion lights flickering on at 2:12 a.m. The absence feels different this time. Not loaded, not anticipatory. Final. I don't mistake that for safety. I understand now that danger isn't always the moment of contact. Sometimes it's the pattern that reshapes you long after the predator leaves. Dogmen rarely show themselves. When they do, it isn't spectacle. It's selection. And if you ever feel that slow erosion of boundaries, the subtle invitation to engage, to measure, to respond, understand this. The most dangerous step is not when they cross your threshold. It's when you begin stepping toward theirs. I'm telling you this as someone who did both, and I can still feel, some nights, the phantom weight of a clawed hand resting over my heart, steadying it, as if reminding me how easily it matched my rhythm once, and how easily it could again. And it ends the only way a story like this ever could. Not with a gunshot, not with applause, not with revenge, but with silence. Because the truth about men like him is this: they don't win by being louder. They win by not breaking. The hearing that was supposed to humiliate him became something else entirely. It became exposure, not of him, of them. The board members who smirked at the beginning were stone-faced by the end. The HOA president who once weaponized policy now clutched a stack of printed complaints, most of them about her. Neighbors who had once whispered now watched openly. The attempted eviction, thrown out. The child endangerment narrative, officially dismissed. The harassment complaint, formally recorded. But the real shift wasn't procedural, it was psychological. Because once a bully is forced to confront a wall that does not flinch, the game changes. He didn't gloat, he didn't taunt. He simply walked out of that room, one hand resting gently on the stroller handle, his wife beside him, their newborn sleeping peacefully under a soft blanket. The hallway was quiet, and for the first time since they moved in, so was the neighborhood. In the weeks that followed, something subtle but undeniable happened. The drive-bys stopped. The anonymous complaints stopped. The concerned conversations stopped. People began nodding instead of staring. Some even apologized. Not dramatically, not loudly, just quietly. and he accepted those apologies the same way he handled everything else, calmly. Because strength doesn't require spectacle. It requires consistency. The HOA president eventually resigned. Officially, it was for personal reasons. Unofficially, it was because power without control is fragile. And once someone sees through it, the illusion collapses. He never mentioned his job again. Never had to. But word travels in ways policy documents don't. And when someone new moved into the neighborhood and casually asked about that family at the corner house, the answer was always the same. They keep to themselves, good people. That was enough. Months passed. The baby grew. Nights were sleepless for entirely different reasons now. Feedings, crying, tiny hiccups in the dark. He'd walk the floor at 2 a.m., holding that small life against his chest, feeling the steady heartbeat beneath his palm. And sometimes, in the quiet, he'd think about that day in the parking lot, the demand, the entitlement, the audacity. And he'd feel nothing. Not anger, not resentment, just clarity. Because that moment had revealed something fundamental. You don't measure a man by how fast he reacts. You measure him by what he protects. His wife healed, too. Not from physical harm, there had been none, but from the subtle erosion that comes from being targeted. She laughed easier again. She walked the neighborhood without scanning every porch. She felt safe, not because danger no longer existed, but because she knew she was not standing alone. That's the part no one saw on camera. Not the hearing, not the confrontation, not the rumors. The part where a family simply continued living. Barbecues in the backyard, late-night conversations on the porch, a stroller parked by the door like any other house. Ordinary life reclaimed. And that's what makes the story unsettling for the kind of person who started it. Because she expected drama. She expected chaos. She expected escalation. What she encountered instead was composure, documentation, boundaries, and an immovable wall of quiet strength. There was no explosive revenge, no cinematic takedown, no shouted threats, just consequences, calmly delivered. The truth is, he didn't win because he was a Navy SEAL. He won because he refused to be baited into becoming the villain of someone else's narrative. He didn't flex his rank. He didn't weaponize intimidation. He didn't escalate. He stayed disciplined. And discipline beats theatrics every time. The final irony? The very community that once tried to police his family now felt safer knowing he lived there. Because when a storm eventually did roll through, a real one this time, he was the first outside, helping secure loose fencing, checking on elderly neighbors, carrying sandbags without being asked. Protection doesn't announce itself. It shows up, quietly, repeatedly, without expectation of praise. So yes, this is the last part, not because the story ends in a blaze of glory, but because it resolves in something stronger. Stability, respect, peace, the kind earned, not demanded. And somewhere in that same neighborhood, someone still remembers the day a woman demanded a newborn, like it was a misplaced package. But what they remember more clearly is the man who didn't raise his voice, didn't flinch, didn't fold. He simply stood, and that was enough.